Good afternoon. Welcome back from your lunch breaks, and thank you very much for joining us for this second session of today's 6th annual Future of Transport conference, where we'll be focusing on smart mobility and decarbonisation for a greener transport sector. I'm Lara Natale, Mobility, Tech, Media and Telecom Director at the Centre on Regulation in Europe, known as CER, where we're very engaged in smart mobility and how to achieve transport decarbonisation. And in fact, we recently published a digital roadmap for public transport authorities on mobility as a service. So I've been listening to Mr. Hololai's remarks this morning on multimodality emphasis and his keynote, as indeed representing the DG, which he leads, December 2020 communication, will have left us in no doubt at all as to the scale of ambition of the European Commission and the grasp of the size and the range of priorities that we have to engage with via the Green New Deal. So having a decarbonised system for fueling transport by 2050 will mean that we need to look at alternative fuels, multimodality, as well as thinking about what technology and automation can do to help make that vision a reality. And as with all innovation-centred questions, the input of business will be crucial. We've already heard about some great initiatives from industry representatives earlier this morning. And that's the basis on which we're continuing this afternoon. So we welcome speakers who will provide us with a range of perspectives here. We have Daniel Maes, Member of Cabinet for Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans at the European Commission. Daniel, welcome. We also have Annelise Thier-Blemont, Vice President of Government Affairs for Qualcomm, William Todds, Executive Director for Transport and Environment, and Diana Zhao, Senior Director for Global Alliances and Policy at Virgin Hyperloop. I'll come round to you all for your introductory remarks on smart mobility and decarbonisation, and then we can take some questions. So we're in for a very exciting hour and a quarter. Daniel, as part of Vice President Timmermans' team, you're of course at the heart of the Commission's Green New Deal efforts. Many areas of the services are working on smart mobility and decarbonisation of transport. So over to you for the first set of introductory remarks. Thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here because actually it's, I think, a very timely conference and a very timely topic. We're of course doing this under special circumstances, like really literally online, because we're still living in a very challenging situation, the pandemic. In my own home country, it's slowly coming out of a total confinement. Non-essential shops are slowly opening by pre-ordered deliveries to pick up in the shop. So it's still a very tough situation for anybody really working on mobility, because certainly not everything is moving as it should. So that's very challenging. That's why we also really put the mobility sector as a whole at the heart of our recovery efforts in Europe, and the recovery funds that we want to use to get us out of this pandemic. Of course, at the same time, coming from the Green Deal perspective, which I represent here, we also see that the citizens' demands for climate action hasn't gone away. Of course, most people now really care about their health and their well-being and their jobs, but the concerns about climate change hasn't gone away. And climate action is still a very big popular demand. Over 70% of citizens still demand climate action. So it is our firm view within the Commission, also at the highest leadership, including the European leaders in the Council, that this recovery must be one that brings us also forward in terms of tackling climate change. So a green recovery where we recover the mobility sector in a way that we can also face these long-term challenges that we have on the climate agenda. And really seriously, this conference, when it comes to the crossroads of transport and technology, it couldn't be more timely, because that's exactly where we are. This may sound challenging for a lot of people, but I think that lots of it, what we want to see in terms of direction, we're already seeing. We're seeing cities where metros were connected, and with sensors one could see how loaded they were, and people needed to go out, or a physical distancing couldn't take place, and then people could take a bike on new cycling lanes when that happened. So we really see that cities that were smarter were more crisis-proof, and cities that were more sustainable, with, for instance, more cycling lanes, were more crisis-proof. And that's really something that we want to learn from by accelerating this transition. And I think that there's really an irreversible trend that when we come out of this pandemic, our mobility needs to become smarter and more sustainable. And we have pretty high climate ambitions. The European leaders recently endorsed that even and increased that ambition. By 2050, we want to be climate neutral, which means that most of our road transport, for instance, also needs to be climate neutral. The overall transport sector needs to then reduce its carbon emissions by greenhouse gas emissions by 90%. And 2030, we want to cut our emissions by 55% compared to the situation that we had in 1990. So that is quite ambitious, and where we have to see at the intersection of technology, how technology can also help us to get there. And if you would ask me to capture the future of transport in that way in 3 words, the 3 words I would choose would be electrification, multimodality, and mobility as a service, in the sense of like everything, all the transport modes coming together in one app and one digital ticket. And I'll quickly run through them briefly, if that's okay. So when it comes to electrification, now also with demands for higher air quality in the city, I think it's also the time to accelerate the shift to zero emission cars. We set high ambitions in our mobility strategy that was already mentioned in December 2020. By 2030, we would like to see 30 million zero emission cars on the road, and some people are even saying that that is a record that can already be beaten. But still, it's quite a heavy ambition. And my message also today is that we will take our responsibility at the European level to get this done. A key tool that we have is our CO2 standards for cars, which we will revise in June this year to make sure that we have a clearer and more ambitious pathway towards that zero emission mobility. I often hear a lot that when it comes to the CO2 standards that these are set on unrealistic levels. And I think that we often underestimate how quickly the market is already moving and how quickly people are moving around us. People said the CO2 standards were unrealistic, but I think that what you see now with the current CO2 emission targets that we have for the cars, lots of manufacturers are actually on the way to meet these targets. So have understood this need to shift to zero emission mobility. And we see new announcements coming by every week practically about further move to electric mobility, and even truck makers are now joining that phrase. So I think we should not ever underestimate where the markets are already moving in that sense. So we tend to double down on that. With this clearer pathway towards the zero emission mobility with our CO2 standards. That's not only a question of climate targets. For us, that's clearly also a question of pure industrial strategy that we would like to see. If you look at the situation now when it comes to the new patents for transport technology on the road, most of them relate to electrification. It's about charging points, electric propulsion systems. 63% of those patents are currently in the US, Japan, and other countries in Asia, and we want Europe to lead in that too. We want Europe to lead in this type of mobility. So that's why we need these emission standards to trigger this right investment so that the European industry, the car industry, can lead also into the future. And for us, it's also a question of basic fairness. The more affordable cars you have produced by the car makers, the more affordable they become, the electric and the other zero emission cars, because the more of them, the price goes down. And really, when you look at the fuel use that you would save, the petrol fuel use that would save, I would say that, we could be in for a surprise that actually this is really good for low-income families, that if you move to an electric car, that you save a lot of fuel. And for those people, it's often very much a big chunk of their wallet. So electrification is the first trend I would see in the technology. The second is multimodality, as I said. We see that emerging in the cities. We also want to put more focus on rail transport as a clean mode of transport. We seriously want to work on making now concrete improvement in the field of passenger rail for quick connections between capitals. So really seeing in a very pragmatic way, how can we make sure that timetables align better, capacity is planned better, so that these connections become quicker. The same for freight. We want that to become more digital and more reliable, because I think that when it comes to rail freight, the issue is not so much the price anymore nowadays. People do like sustainable forms of transport also for their freight, but it's really the reliability that we need to work on. The digital technology will be key in that sense. I think this multimodality will become a more important issue as we go by, because we see more and more recovery packages coming out. Certain airlines already there for asking for a third bailout. And at a certain point, you will have to have a discussion. When we put the taxpayers' money into that, can't we put that in a way that everybody benefits, that more transport modes benefit from the rescue of one company? So the question is, should we not bank on these developments that you see more airlines selling more tickets on trains to feed their planes? We see that in Germany now also arising, in France, in my home country, the Netherlands, and I think that's the type of question to be had to make sure that we invest the taxpayers' money in a responsible way. And again, technology will be key there, because when it comes to connecting all these modes, rail with road, air, and water, digital technology, there's no doubt in my mind that is really important to get to this transport system. We would like ideally to see everything coming together in one app, so that in a city, next to the freedom to have a car, you can really have the freedom to choose to travel from one place to the other and see, is there an electronic bike, is there an electronic scooter, is there a car hailing service that I can use, a public transport company. We would like to see that, and in one ticket. I think that one very important initiative also for the Green Deal is that we want to work on this integrated ticketing, really that you can get one ticket digitally for multiple transport modes. So we will come out with some proposals on that as the Commission. We will start with looking at common ways to share the data according to common standards. It becomes easier to integrate that into one of these tickets. And then later on, we will follow up with initiatives to make sure that the responsibilities of ticket vendors and all the players in the chain are clear, so that passengers can really use this to travel door to door, by bus, by train, by plane ultimately. So that will come next year probably, and it may be that we will need some regulatory proposals on that, but we have to look at that. But it is clearly our ambition. So that is, I think, when it comes to me, like at this crossroads of transport technology, three things that I think are really important: electrification, multimodality, and digital in one app and one ticket. I think the one crisis a lesson that we really draw is that there's no limit to human creativity. We found new ways to move around. We discovered old ways like the bikes, but also found new ways by digitally looking for the right option. Human creativity won't beat, and I'm really sure that we can count on human creativity to also get this future right. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think you've captured really well there. You said at the beginning where we are is this intersection of transport and tech, and I think your three takeaways of electrification, multimodality, and mass. You've given a really good overview for us to lead to the next remarks with. So thank you very much. And Lise, over to you now. And good. I was going to say good morning for you, but I think it might be good middle of the night still for both you and Diana. So thank you so much for accommodating our time zone. And in your role at Qualcomm, you'll of course be thinking a lot about improving connectivity, especially I was listening to this morning's panel on 5G, where we heard about data-driven innovation, for example, and we can think about this as well as we look to the digitalization of infrastructure and what emissions benefits this can bring. So I'm sure you've got lots to tell us about, and I'll hand straight over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. So I will present to you the view of the industry and Qualcomm, as well as in my position of Global Policy Chair for the 5G Automotive Association. I will present some of the views that we have with regard to smart mobility and decarbonization for greener transport. So next slide. Just a few words on 5G. Which we probably have heard already today, but just to mention that 5G is here. It's accelerating globally. In Europe, there are over 40 mobile operators having launched across 24 countries. They are predicting 750 million 5G smartphones in 2022. And we have about 2.8 billion 5G connection by 2025. So the point here is 5G is deploying much faster, 2G faster than 4G 10 years ago. So next slide. So when it comes to 5G, one of the key aspects of 5G is the digital transformation. It will impact all type of industries. It will enable about 3.1 trillion of global sales activity by 2035. And in all those industries becoming smarter, transforming digitally, they will all have an impact on the environment, directly or indirectly, enabling new use cases that will make those smart industry greener. Obviously the focus of today is transportation. So next slide, transportation digitalization is a driving force to a cleaner mobility and to achieve the EU ambition of reducing greenhouse gas emission. So what you see here is a variety of use cases that highlight the impact on the environment. So while, of course, connectivity will change many aspects of urban mobility with smart building, enabling safer mobility across the roads, it is also applicable across different road, highways, motorways, secondary road. The aspect of urban mobility in particular is very interesting because it brings all of those connected use cases from edge artificial intelligence, to be able to detect pedestrian on the road when they're crossing different intersection, pedestrian or also bikes, motorcycle and cars or public transportation. They're all sharing a same utility that are the transport roads. And then you have use cases that are enabled by V2X, vehicle to everything type of connectivity that can update, for example, 3D HD map real time to your car or to your bikes. And then finally, when it comes to connectivity, it adds all the localization aspect, whether by satellite, by different sensors, to be able to detect lane detection when you want to pass. So you need high accuracy localization. All of those come together when, for example, Danielle earlier mentioned multimodal aspect. Obviously, you need digital infrastructure to tie in all those transportation links all together. Of course, connectivity is not like the magical wand to achieve clean mobility. It will also bring aspect of zero fatalities on the road, zero emission. It all supports those sustainable and societal goals. So next slide. So 5G, as we see it, and for many industry stakeholders in 5G AA, is a key enabler for greener transport sector. It will enable a cleaner and fully connected and automated mobility by creating real-time connectivity between all actors of road mobility. It will be key to reach higher level of automation that will reshape cities and more urban mobility. For autonomous system to make real-time decision in high-density traffic, new applications are required, particularly, as I mentioned, sensor sharing or trajectory alignment between different vehicles. When we come to technology evolution, 5G V2X will also enable high added value services for more efficient, for example, door-to-door planning, coordinating driving maneuver by avoiding stop-and-go traffic and increased traffic comfort, coordinating speed behavior to improve traffic flow. So a key message here is it will benefit from a European regulatory framework that fosters the development of 5G and cooperative, connected and automated mobility to ensure Europe competitiveness in view of the massive deployment of connectivity in China and the US. So the Commission strategy on smart and sustainable mobility will be a key pillar to the future of Europe and the future of transport. Next slide. So I'll finish on that message that maybe some of you had the opportunity to listen to a previous session where the Dutch Institute TNO presented on a study that was commissioned by 5GA in 2020, shows the evidence of potential and the potential of cellular vehicle to everything technology to help decrease emission. how exactly those connectivity technology can help. So first, by increasing transport efficiency and driving pattern, thus reducing congestion, fuel consumption, and therefore emission. But also by creating new ways around traffic flow management and better localized environment control by, for example, dynamic geofencing. And finally, by opening a whole new world of synergy around multimodal mobility. This is a complex ecosystem, to be honest. The key here will be a close collaboration between public authorities, between the private sector, that will be essential for this service to reach critical mass and have, therefore, a significant impact. And finally, a combination of road safety, connected and automated mobility, and clean mobility will allow the reduction of road transport emission to reach the Green Deal targets. I thank you for your attention today, and I'll leave it back to you, Lara.
Very much, Annelise. I also think in talking about connected mobility, it actually captures really well. This panel is sitting between the 5G panel and the one that will follow on road safety, and also you picked up a lot on some of Daniel's remarks on where European regulation might go moving forward. And with that, over to William. So William, transport and environment has obviously been working for a very long time on questions of decarbonisation. You'll have looked at it across various forms of transport, alternative fuels, etc., which will bring a new dimension to this discussion now. So let's pass over to you for your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks for inviting me to this conference, which has been a great conference already. I think it's a very timely conference. We're 4 months away from what I think is going to be the largest and most important climate package, push of regulatory measures that I've seen in my lifetime. And I also think that the focus of this conference is exactly right. A strong focus on technology, which is, as far as we're concerned, one of the key ways to solve the climate puzzle. Now, if we start with the basics, Transport and Environment is an organization that exists to make transport clean. We are an organization that believes that mobility is a good thing, transport is a good thing, but we have a problem with pollution. And the transport pollution or the transport climate problem is a really huge problem. Transport is the largest source of CO2 emissions in Europe, and that is also true in other developed economies. And it is also a source of pollution in most of our cities. Now, our fundamental belief is that people, when given the choice, they will do the right thing. But you need to make it as easy and as convenient as possible for them to travel around in an emissions-free manner. We need to make emissions-free, zero-emission travel, be it on the road or in the sky. We need to make that the norm. And so what I will do in the next few minutes is talk about how we see the future in road transport and how we see the future in aviation and shipping. Now, if you look at road transport, I think it's clear that in inner cities, that a combination of walking, cycling, public transport, shared electric vehicles already today can deliver 100% of our mobility needs in a manner that is, from an environmental point of view, optimal. This is the direction that many cities in Europe are taking, and actually that's what cities around the globe are moving towards. But I think it's equally clear that most people do not live in inner cities. Hundreds of millions of people in Europe live in the suburbs, in the countryside, in the villages and towns that make up Europe. And we need to provide solutions to those people as well. And those people are very often relying on car travel. We sell 15 million cars in Europe every year. And so a very large part of our focus is to make those cars as clean as we can. And clean these days means zero emissions. And that de facto means for road transport, particularly for passenger cars, it means electric vehicles. And that's why we as an organization have spent so much of our efforts and our resources working on the European CO2 standards. The European CO2 standards that Daniel mentioned are a regulation, a law that forces car makers to invest in clean vehicles, and not just to invest, but also to sell those vehicles to people. And what that means is that you end up in a situation where people go to a showroom, people go to a dealer, and the dealer is going to try to sell them a clean and electric car. So it's not about moralizing people about their individual responsibility. It's about changing the system. Now, I want to say, add to what Daniel said on electrification and how fast this is going. I think it's underappreciated how successful the European CO2 standards actually are. We have seen in the last couple of years almost 100 billion euros invested in electrification in Europe. Gigafactories are being constructed, dozens of gigafactories are being constructed as we speak, and our car makers are one by one, and I hope soon they will all commit. Today, Volvo committed to going all electric by 2030. So this is going very fast, and it's going a lot faster than people thought it could. And I think we need to continue on this path. So increase the stringency of the CO2 standards and set an end date for the combustion engine, like the United Kingdom has done, like California has done. And I think we need to acknowledge that technology is changing very fast. When I joined Transport and Environment now nearly 10 years ago, everybody said trucks cannot be decarbonized. They will take the last drop of diesel. That is now very different. I think it's clear when you listen to truck makers like Scania say that by 2030, they expect 50% of trucks to be electric. Well, I think it's very clear that we have no excuse not to push the envelope there as well. So with the combination of battery electric and fuel cell trucks, we have what it takes to go zero emissions in the trucking sector too. Now, the heavy lifting needs to be done by the automotive industry because the vehicles are key. But I think it's also clear that when you move from petrol and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles, that you move to something that resembles a smartphone or a tablet on wheels. And smartphones and tablets need to be charged at home, at work, and whilst you're traveling. And that's also true for cars and trucks. And we're seeing good things happening in some countries, in particular in places like the Netherlands. But we're also seeing parts of Europe where that charging infrastructure is not being rolled out fast enough or comprehensively enough. And that's why we as an organization have taken the unprecedented step of teaming up with ASEA and with the consumer groups to write to the European Commission, to DG Move, but also to Mr. Timmermans, to ask the Commission to come forward with a law that forces all EU nations to put in place the charging infrastructure that we need to go all electric. Because and that's the last thing I will say on electric vehicles. Our goal is not for electric cars to be a nice, second car that you can use to drive to the city to commute or to do your shopping. Our goal is for electric vehicles to satisfy 100% of people's mobility needs, and that requires people to also cross borders. Now, transport is obviously more than cars and trucks. Aviation and shipping are large, and in the case of aviation, fast-growing sources of emission. Of course, today that is not the case. But once we go out of the lockdowns, people will start flying again in Europe and in the rest of the world. And I think we need to face the fact. And the fact is that aviation is not going to go away. Shipping is not going to go away. Modal shift is not going to solve that problem for us. It might contribute, but it won't solve the problem. So we need to develop technological solutions for aviation and shipping too. And here I'm very excited because for the first time in our lifetime, there is a realistic prospect that we can fly and sail in an emissions-free manner. And that is thanks to the development and the prospects of hydrogen, where the European Commission and a number of big EU nations are investing tens and tens of billions to make that to scale up hydrogen. Now, what we need to do from a transport perspective is we need to make sure that all the electrolyzers that are being built, all the hydrogen that is going to be supplied, that the transport sector creates secure demand for that hydrogen. And we can do that in aviation and shipping. And the European Commission, DG Move, Mrs. Valian, Mr. Hollolai, they're developing two regulations, the Refuel EU Maritime and the Refuel EU Aviation regulations, which will force fuel suppliers and shipping companies to take on clean forms of fuels. And this, there's a lot to say about it, but just in summary, I think this is the opportunity that we have to lay the foundation for zero emission flying and sailing in a way that is made in Europe. It's a big industrial opportunity also. So I want to end on that optimistic note. I think compared to where we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we have made so much progress. We now have all the technologies that we need to decarbonize the transport system. We have the political will, thanks to the Green Deal. And I think we have an opportunity in the next 2-3 years to take a decisive step towards a genuinely sustainable transport system. And if we do that, that will not just be good news for our planet, it will also be good news for jobs, for our energy security, and for the European economy. Thank you.
Thank you, William. It's also great to be hearing so many positive visions. We think that there's a lot to work towards and a lot to do, but it's great to hear the hope from all the speakers so far. And I thought it was very striking as well, you mentioning the unprecedented cooperation you're having with stakeholders from different disciplines and priority groups, and indeed the challenges of the green and digital transitions are forcing us to break down silos, which is maybe something we can explore a bit further as we progress through this discussion. Diana, though, let's hear from you first because, well, I understand it's an equally early morning for you. Hopefully the sun will rise where you are soon, and thanks for joining us in any case. Hyperloop is really at the forefront of innovation in transport, and you're putting sustainability as well as safety certainly front and center of Hyperloop's communications. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you on how Hyperloop might integrate into a high-speed rail continent such as Europe, and what do you foresee as the contribution Hyperloop could think of making towards the Green New Deal becoming a reality?
Great, thank you, Laura, and it's great to be here today. I really enjoyed hearing all the speakers before me talk about the importance of electrification, of carbon reduction, of multimodality. I think these are all really important aspects of the way we think about the future of transportation. So it's really exciting to hear about all of these topics, and most especially the importance of all of these topics and how we're thinking about planning for the future of transportation. Let me talk a little bit first about the technology. My company, Virgin Hyperloop, is a company that is developing the Hyperloop technology. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with what a Hyperloop is, I would think of it essentially as a network of long-range autonomous vehicles. So we have pods that travel in a near vacuum environment at speeds of over 1,000 kilometers an hour, and using zero direct emissions, using magnetic levitation and our own electric propulsion system. So what you see here in this diagram is a picture of our pod, which is a passenger or cargo vehicle. For passengers, it can carry up to 28 people per pod. So this is quite similar to a small bus in that sense. Or it can carry cargo, palletized cargo mainly. It hangs on a bogie, which is actually very similar to an electric vehicle chassis. It uses active magnetic levitation to levitate from our track, which means there are no wheels, there's no friction, so you don't get the wear and tear and the high maintenance cost of rail. And then all of it is propelled electrically with our proprietary electromagnetic propulsion system. And so when you combine all of these things together, you get a system that can go at speeds of over 1,000 kilometers an hour. We've put the bogie and the fuselage, our pod, into this low pressure environment, our tube, essentially, and we take all the air out of the tube to reduce the aerodynamic drag. Effectively, we are creating our own environment with an atmosphere pressure of 1/1000th of what you see here on Earth. And so what that does, it allows us to go very, very fast using very little energy. And then finally, all of this is controlled with our autonomous control platform, which is basically a software platform that controls the movement of the pods, but also how it interacts with other pods in the network, how we control the movement of pods going from one station to another, what we call our portals, and then also, more importantly, how the pod is demand responsive. So we've developed an entire system where you're able to call a pod similar to the way one can call an Uber or a Lyft or other ride-hailing vehicle today. You're able to call a pod with something like a smartphone or any other technology, and be able to get to the pod that is closest to the station that is where you are. So all of these aspects of the way we're thinking about not just creating a technology that can go very, very fast in a way that is using no direct emissions, completely electric, completely sustainable. We're thinking about it also in terms of how we operate the system, how we manage the fleet, and ensuring that our energy footprint is as low as possible. Just move to the next slide. The way we are thinking about the technology is not only in terms of developing a really, really cool and futuristic technology, but also in terms of how we're implementing it. So equally important is understanding that this system that we're developing today is something that can help the EU achieve its carbon neutrality goals by designing it to be a system that is high capacity mass transit system. By high capacity, I mean 50,000 passengers per hour per direction. We're able to do this because of the way the pods can convoy with each other, or be virtually coupled to one another. So therefore, it can become a system that can transport mass amounts of people going from point to point. It's also an on-demand and direct-to-destination routing system. So it's on-demand in the way that I've talked about previously, being able to call a pod when you need one. But it's also direct to destination, which means that as a passenger, when you get into a pod, it will go directly to the destination without any intermediate stops along the way. And we're able to do that because of the smaller nature of the pod, which I mentioned earlier, carries at most 28 people per pod. So you're not waiting for 1,000 people to show up, 100 other people to show up before the pod will move forward. You're only waiting for 20, 25, at most 27 other people to show up. And so the waiting time for that is actually not that high. We've thought a lot about what the passenger experience looks like. This is a question that we get a lot. Well, what does it feel like to ride in a Hyperloop pod? And we've actually done a lot of analysis and a lot of focus groups to understand when somebody takes that journey, when somebody takes a new experience like that, what are the things that are important to them? And we've worked with several renowned architecture and design firms all around the world to come up with this rendering of the interior of a pod, which we actually just released a couple of weeks ago. The inside, as you see here, it can comfortably fit 28 people, but the way we've designed it takes into account things like accessibility. So for example, our pod is at level with the station, so that it is very easy for anybody to walk onto the pod itself. We've designed listening cues, sound cues, even smell cues in the pod, so that somebody who is mobility challenged may have other cues that can help point them in the right direction, or so that they feel a sense of safety and comfort when they're inside the pod. And something that is very obvious here is the skylight that is on the top of the pod. A lot of questions that we get are around, well, how does it feel claustrophobic when you're inside the pod? Well, we've actually worked with designers to create an interior where it feels like you're looking up into the sky. Yes, it is a skylight. Yes, there aren't windows at the top of the pod, but we're able to create, using the technology that we have today, this type of experience that makes passengers feel very safe and comfortable in the inside of the pod. And then finally, when it comes to deploying and working with transport authorities and city planners and urban planners around the world, we've really designed an infrastructure that is flexible, can fit into the footprint of these already very dense urban environments, and can integrate with other modes. And so this is something that is very important to us when we're thinking about how do we deploy this, how do we make this into a system that others will want to ride on, will choose to ride on. And so having that flexible infrastructure, that small footprint that's able to accommodate existing city plans was extremely important to us. And we're working very closely with various planning authorities around the world today to make this happen. As a company, one of the most important things to us is that we are developing the technology, but that we are also testing and showing that it works. The number one question that I get asked when I talk to anybody about this is, well, can I ride on it? Or has somebody written on the Hyperloop pod? And I'm really excited to tell you all that yes, somebody has written on it. In fact, 4 people have written on the Hyperloop pod. Just last November, we passed big milestones where we had the first passengers who ever traveled safely on a Hyperloop. What you see here in this picture is a very joyous, the first 2 passengers on the pod. On the left-hand side is our CEO and co-founder, Josh Geigel, and on the right-hand side is our head of passenger experience, Sarah Lukian. And both of these folks, traveled on the pod. They were the first passengers ever on the pod back in November. It is a 2-seater. This pod itself that you see here is a 2-seater prototype vehicle, and the point of it was to demonstrate many of the Hyperloop safety critical systems. So when it comes to air replenishment, when it comes to life critical systems that are in the pod itself, this test was really a test of the safety critical aspects of the system to demonstrate that we could run people, put people on the pod. All of this was done and verified by an independent safety assessor, Certifer, who is based out of France. They do this for rail systems and other types of transportation modes around the world. And it was really important to us that we brought in an independent external body to validate that the system that we were developing is the safest system possible for people. We reached a speed of just over 170 kilometers per hour on our test track, which is 500 meters. So going from 0 to 172, back to 0 again in less than half a kilometer. And we were able to do it safely and securely. It was in a vacuum. We get that question a lot. The test was done in a vacuum, and that was hence why it was so important to have that validation by an independent safety assessor to ensure that all the safety critical systems are there today. So I will end with this. I've talked a lot about the technology. I've talked a lot about what we've done as Virgin Hyperloop as a company. But one of the reasons why this is so critical to us and why this is so important to us at this point today is because we need all types of solutions working together to achieve the EU's very ambitious but very necessary goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. Currently, transport represents about 25% of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions. As the previous speaker mentioned, it is the largest source of carbon emissions across all sectors. And so it's really important that we take steps to reduce that. But even more impending, there is a goal by the European Commission that all scheduled collective travel under 500 kilometers needs to be carbon neutral by 2030. But at the same time, there is also a goal that to double high-speed rail traffic by 2030, to triple it by 2050, and also increase rail freight traffic 50% by 2030 and double by 2050. So on one hand, you are increasing the demand while simultaneously eliminating the carbon emissions. And it is really, really challenging, definitely, to do this. And we've heard a lot today about the challenges not just in the rail sector, but aviation and also automotive sector to be able to achieve this. So we really believe that we need to have all options on the table when it comes to meeting these goals. Hyperloop can be one of those options. I'm sure there are a bunch of other options as well. We believe that Hyperloop is one very compelling option to have on the table that allows the European Union to achieve these. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Diana. It's great to hear more about Hyperloop, and it's definitely one reason to look forward to travel restrictions eventually easing after the pandemic, even if it may yet be a little while before most of us get the opportunity to experience a Hyperloop ride. Thank you. And I noticed as well, you were mentioning the investments Hyperloop is making in developing the technology, and certainly Daniel spoke of the recovery funds and how we'll spend those, and a lot of targets have been mentioned today. Maybe just to throw in another one, there are definitely targets for the amount of spending on digital infrastructure in the Next Generation EU funds, for example, where they're talking about 20% of spending going on that. So also very relevant for this discussion, I think. We have questions coming in from the audience, which is great, which we can start to take. Let me start with one from Steve Phillips, who's Secretary General at the Conference of European Directors of Roads. And Steve's question is the European Commission placing too much emphasis on modal shift in railways? And should it instead concentrate more on decarbonising and supporting all forms of road transport, including bus and coach? Maybe Daniel, that seems to be addressed at the Commission, so I'll come to you first on that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and also for that question. No, clearly, like the take that we have on also in the mobility strategy is that we need all transport modes in our mobility system, but we all need them to become cleaner. So each one of them, each single one of them needs to become cleaner to be part of this future mobility system. But that indeed includes also the road transport. So we are also ambitious when it comes to making sure that we will get zero emission trucks as soon as that is possible. And as William also said, developments are going quicker than we could have anticipated a year ago, with announcements also on zero emission trucks. Particular challenges also, we really need to then make sure that we invest in the charging and refueling infrastructure in the right way. So that's really an area where the energy transition and transport transition need to go together, but we certainly don't lose track of that. As also with another question that I saw, I spoke a lot about electrification. Should have also talked a bit about the electrons, the e-fuels, which William also mentioned. We indeed see, also really potential for that in aviation and maritime, as he said. And the other challenge will be, we will come out with proposals to give really a serious regulatory boost. And for us, these proposals that William mentioned, the refuel aviation and fuel maritime, need to get us on this clear pathway towards these, synthetic kerosene and the e-fuels. But there we really need to also build a supply chain almost from scratch. So we need to really get serious in our hydrogen plans to make sure that these electrolyzers, as William also said, can go as quickly into these, can produce as quickly as possible these e-fuels that we need in aviation. I think that's a general point that is very important to everything of this, because indeed I am one of these hopeful people that we can build this mobility of the system of the future. But the challenge is to really make this just and fair, and the people have the feeling that they can also be part of this mobility system, no matter whether they live on the countryside or somewhere else. That means that when we connect our mobility offers, we need to make sure that the 5G is also in the countryside so that the people can play a role. E-bikes are a way to democratize cycling also for people living on the countryside. And also there will always be corners of Europe, like islands, that you cannot reach by train, and there we need clean aviation to step to the fore. So all of that is really needed to make this just and fair, because our agenda is urgent, but it really needs to be also persuasive, and people need to be able to come along with it.
Thank you, Daniel. Do any other speakers have views on that question before I move on to the next one? No? Okay, let's take another question then. This is from Henk Zwarto, apologies, I'm trying my best with pronunciation, who is Vice President of the European Cyclist Federation. And Henk asks whether making cars zero emissions, will hardly reduce congestion, inefficiency and unhealthy lifestyles, nor will it improve the livability of our cities. We also need to get people out of their cars onto public transport and electric bicycles. And these are certainly points you've all made in your remarks too. How do we balance then the technological shift with the behavioural and modal shift? That's a very interesting question. Annelies, shall we gain some views from you and then possibly William?
Thank you, Lara. Yes, no, this is absolutely right. We are not looking, and we shouldn't be looking at zero car emission only in one way or another. I think we've all been saying that on this panel. Electrification is key, enabling more vulnerable road users like bikes, like pedestrian, like buses and coach and rail. This is not, we need to get out of the cliche that this is cars against bike, against public transportation. They all have a role to play. When it comes to the industry, as I mentioned earlier, we are at the forefront of providing the fabric, a unified fabric made as connectivity, 5G, 4G, and all sort of connectivity to enable all those modes of transportation, to enable more use cases that will play a direct or most often an indirect role, but still significant role to sustainability goals. So absolutely agree. And again, it's not cities against the countryside. We all have to look at all different aspects. And finally, last remark, when we come to road safety, you don't immediately think of reducing road safety. We actually bring environmental benefit. You won't have like emergency intervention of different roads. You'll have, healthier lifestyle, as was mentioned in the question. So again, we need to look at all those use cases, all the technology as a way to improve the environment and make the EU a greener, a clean mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Annelies. William?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a really, really good question. I agree with Annelies that there's no contradiction here. I think we need to do both. We need to replace all petrol cars by zero emission vehicles. And if we do that, we will make a huge step towards a decarbonized transport system, but it won't be enough. We also at urban level, in particular at city level, we need to start following the examples of Copenhagen, of Amsterdam, of Ghent, and all those other cities that are leading on this. But I do want to emphasize that if we, and that would be massive for quality of life in Europe and in those places. But if all cities in Europe or all cities in the world follow the example of Copenhagen and Amsterdam, we would not have solved the climate problem. So we need to do more than that. The second point relating to automation and connectivity, here I think there's enormous theoretical potential, and that makes me that makes me very excited. But I think there's still some questions as to what the practical potential will be for automated and connected vehicles. Because as far as I know, if you make vehicles a lot more convenient and a lot cheaper to run, you're likely to get more of them. So that's one of the things we should probably talk about. And a third and final point, and this is, I lead a transport and environment federation, so we get this question about cars versus cycling all the time. I think it's also about what questions you ask to what people. Should we be asking Daniel Miss and Mr. Timmermans to focus on cycling lanes? I don't think so, because the European Commission is really good at regulating and doing big industry stuff, and he's a lot less good at local policies. Apologies, Daniel. No offense, but I think that's the way it is. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, if we're talking about behavioral shifts, I also noticed in the Hyperloop presentation, embracing a new form of transport like that, where there's also focus on accessibility and getting people to embrace this new mode might involve a behavioral shift too, to some extent. And with that in mind, Diana, there's a question put to you by Meng Lu, who's Strategic Innovation Manager at DINIC. What is the acceleration rate and declaration rate in your design? Large infrastructure investment is needed and large space is needed. What, therefore, is the total estimated investment? Are the annual maintenance costs? Is there anything you can tell us about those?
Yeah, well, those are very specific questions, very good questions, but very specific questions depending on the geography and where ultimately we would build these networks. So I'll take them kind of one at a time. The acceleration rate and the deceleration rates are very similar to rail. So if you watch the video, which I encourage all of you to go onto our YouTube page and watch the passenger test video, from the test that I mentioned back in November, you'll see that it's probably a little bit more forceful than what you might experience in a getting onto a train today, and because that was a test and we were trying to achieve fairly high speeds within a very, very short amount of distance. But ultimately, when we're deploying this, it'll be very similar. It'll be to rail and to other modes of transportation that you have available in the market today. And, it's a very, very smooth ride. So the acceleration rate is, it's not crazy, definitely not a roller coaster. When it comes to the question of large-scale investment, large-scale project deployment, yes, this is infrastructure that we're talking about. It is not it is not the same as putting some bikes on a street corner and hoping that people will take them. This will require planning, long-term planning. It will require also investment, and the way we have been approaching that, it is really a public and private partnership. Getting the public sector to help understand, what are the needs from an accessibility, from a mobility perspective. Where are the corridors that need to be connected, and how do we design this network? How do we regulate it from a safety perspective? How do we ensure that the moment a passenger steps into a Hyperloop station or steps onto a Hyperloop pod, that it is an experience that is safe, that is comfortable to them? So all of that needs to be done with the public authorities, and we have been engaged in various workshops and meetings with the European Commission, with DG Move and Shift to Rail in particular, to figure out how do we as a group, as an industry, move something like this forward. But also I would say, as the European Commission at this moment right now is really thinking about its plan for the next 7-10 years, and think about the objectives of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. There have been many regulations and policies that are currently in discussion at the moment, such as the sustainable and smart mobility strategy that the European Commission has already put out, which explicitly names Hyperloop as one of those game-changing technologies that has the ability for the European Commission to meet its carbon neutrality goals. And we think that is absolutely fantastic. I think as I said earlier, we need to really have all of these options as tools on the table in order to achieve these sustainability objectives.
Very comprehensive answer, and referring back to the strategy as well. Thank you so much. Right, time is running with us, but we do have time for another question, I think. So, and we won't have time to take all the questions that have come in from the audience, so advance apologies for that. Let's look at this one from Annick Rutink, manager for LEVA EU. What is the Commission planning on doing to improve the legislative, technical and safety framework for light electric vehicles, i.e. e-bikes, e-cargo bikes, e-scooters, etc.? So, I mean, I think we can come to Daniel first for that. And after that, I might exercise moderator's privilege of maybe the other speakers could look at what do they believe the Commission should be doing in that area. So Daniel, over to you first.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that question also allows me to respond a bit to what William just also said on in micromobility in cities and the role of Europe in there. Like, it's of course true that Europe is mostly responsible for setting regulation, but I think that underestimates a bit the power that Europe also has, and as an organization that can bring cities together and create alliances and make sure that things happen. And that is really our ambition, because the Climate Target Plan, for a reason, says that increasing the share of cycling and walking and clean public transport in our transport mix in cities is part of the European climate action, because 25% of the transport emissions are in cities. So tackling that alongside the clean mobility is part of the EU climate action. And the way that we see it is that later this year we will also come out with our what we call the urban mobility package, which I would say could be, like sort of a toolbox that cities across Europe could use. Like I want to make an effort to decrease my emissions by X% in 2030 and then go climate neutral by later on. And my mobility is part of that. And I would, one city could say I want to extend public transport. The other could say I want to have more cycling lanes, which I think is always a no-regret investment in that sense. And if you then have a European toolbox that people can use, common best practices, cities can pick and choose what they want to do that with a European menu in the hand, and then you can really bring people together to also procure products together, services together, and then you can make also a difference in getting that clean mobility off the ground. So I do see a role there. And then coming back to the question in particular on also the safety of the micromobility, that is indeed one aspect that we will look at in this urban mobility package, to capture a bit the best practices that we also see in the cities, see whether we can have a common toolbox for that, so that we can have a bit of a consistency across Europe in that sense. Because I do believe that despite the fact that the cities will be the ones responsible for picking what they want to do, Europe can play a role in assembling people together and creating some momentum for this change.
Thank you, Daniel. Do other speakers have comments on what perhaps the EU should be doing in these areas? Annelies?
Yeah, I think that the Commission has a very difficult agenda to tackle in view of all those different priorities, whether it's electrification, CO2 emission, digitalization, decarbonification, and so forth. As I mentioned earlier, with the smart and sustainable strategy that was, launched late last year, this brings already all those aspects together. Recognition that all of those aspects are needed to be tackled. When it comes to digitalization, what we're seeing too, I would add, in addition to cities that will be enabled first, typically with 5G and mode of connectivity, it will be important also we see a role for the Commission, and there are already activities to enable, more the rural areas where there is a harder business case to enable those areas. So we need to be careful in not creating a two-speed, almost two internet speed for cities versus the rest of the EU, where maybe the congestion and the emission are not as high. However, they have a set of issues that are slightly different, but a role in decarbonification. When you think of where the smart factories, where you think of agriculture, so that goes beyond, obviously, transportation of today, but many of those digitalization aspects and their impact on environment will also happen in urban and rural areas.
Thank you, Annelies. William, do you have anything to add on that one?
General observations on what I would like the Commission to do? Okay, well, a wish list then. Well, I mean, I think my takeaway from today's conversation is that there's broad agreement that there's a lot of technologies out there that can help us achieve our climate and our mobility goals. And it's a matter of bringing those technologies up to scale. And I think scale is really super important. If you think about battery cars, why are battery cars expensive? Yeah, because batteries are expensive, but also because these vehicles are being produced at super low volumes. So it's very hard to compete with stuff that is being produced at scale. And that is where European regulation can play a really vital role. And that goes for cars, for trucks, and for planes. And so in terms of my wish list, I think what is really key is that the Commission in 3-4 months' time comes up with CO2 standards for cars and vans, and then a year later for trucks, where they increase the ambition from 2025 onwards, and where they set a long-term goal to ban the sales of combustion engines in Europe, just like the United Kingdom has done, just like California has done, just like Volvo announced today. That is one. I mentioned the importance of a charging law so that people can charge across the union. And I think what is, I will also repeat a little bit what I said before, but on aviation and shipping, for the first time in history, we have an opportunity to actually make those forms of transport emissions free. And I think, we start from a blank sheet of paper on aviation and shipping, and it's a big opportunity. It's also a big risk because we can get it wrong, and there's a big risk that we would spend too much effort on or too much time on biofuels or on LNG. The focus should really be to scale up those technologies that are both sustainable and scalable, and the ones that we need in the long run. So those would be sort of my top 3-4 recommendations to the Commission. Thank you.
I think I see you wanting to reply.
Yeah, I want to add on to what William said, because I agree actually a lot with your point about the economies of scale. I think this is extremely important, especially for new and emerging technologies like the Hyperloop. In order to scale, we really need to have that certainty that the product that we're developing has a market, but also that there is a way to actually deploy this in the real world. And this is where it is extremely important to us that the European Commission and the relevant safety and regulatory authorities play a critical role in this, right? And so we've actually had, as I mentioned earlier, various conversations with DG Move and other parts of the European Commission to understand how one would deploy a Hyperloop, how one would build, construct, and regulate a Hyperloop system, and that type of guidance is actually really important to Hyperloop companies, and I'm sure as well in other industries as well, when it comes to the type of certainty and the type of guidance that is needed for technology companies to understand that the technologies that we are investing in ultimately will have a home. And that's why a lot of our efforts in Europe has been in terms of working with the various standards bodies. So we have been working as part of the Senelec standards body, looking at Hyperloop standards on a European-wide basis. It's a very important body that will ultimately determine and define the standards for Hyperloop, not just from a physical perspective, but from a safety perspective. These types of efforts and initiatives are really important to us, and it's important to know how the European Commission will take that and adopt those standards, and finally also where the regulatory home is. When we deploy this, understanding how it will be treated as a mode of transportation, how it will be regulated as a mode of transportation, and also what types of public funds or public processes it will need to be subject to. All of that provides clarity to a technology company and gives us, as well as our investors, comfort in investing further in this. And I think that is a really critical role that we are looking for from the European Commission.
Thank you so much, Diana. We're fast coming to the end of the session, but we don't want to waste any minutes we do have. So I think we have time to just do a really quick round of wrap-up conclusions and remarks. Perhaps if you could each really stick to 1 minute of what your key message or learning or takeaway has been from this conversation. I think in talking about deployment at larger scale just now, we've also managed to capture 1 or 2 of the questions that came in from the audience that I didn't get to ask more explicitly. If there's one thing I would have loved to spend more time on that we might need to leave to a future occasion, it's more global cooperation, and in particular with the US, seeing as 2 of us speakers are joining them from there, and there's a new Secretary of State for Transport. So if anyone's able to capture that in their 1 minute takeaway, that would be great too. Daniel, let's start with you for your closing remark.
Yeah, I can be brief because I think that indeed Europe's role, helping to deploy these clean technologies as quickly as possible is really the key. Be it by setting dots on the horizon in terms of climate targets, but also digital spending targets, our standards, which have been mentioned, like CO2 standards or alternative transport systems, building alliances. That should be what Europe should be helping out on. I'm wholly convinced that sustainable mobility is smart mobility, so that digital is crucial as an enabler also to get this clean mobility. And I'm also really looking forward to working on the transatlantic in a transatlantic scale on clean technology, which will be one of the priority areas also that my boss will focus on with the new administration. So scale up because the time is now, and Europe is really, the European Commission is really committed to this transition.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Apologies.
Thank you. Yes, as I said, I think digitalization is really at the heart of the transportation and to attain the sustainable goal of the European Commission. Scale is, of course, a very important aspect, and the role of standardization in bringing economies of scale, in bringing harmonization of all those different type of connectivity fabric to meet those goals is essential. And finally, I would say let's get out of the mode of cars versus bike versus buses or rail. All of those modes will have a role to attain in cities and outside in urban and rural areas, equally critical to attain those goals. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Annelies. Diana.
I think the conversation has been great. It's really emphasize the importance of creating an environment and creating a future that is sustainable, that is carbon neutral. And I think one of the really interesting things that we touched on was this behavior shift, right? Getting people out of their cars and into public transportation. I think that is going to be really critical in reducing congestion and in ultimately addressing these issues that we're talking about today. With regards to the US-EU partnership and relationship, I think there's a lot of potential with the new administration, with President Biden's administration, and especially with the new Transport Secretary Buttigieg. I think it is really exciting that we had the Net Council that was stood up by the previous administration, which is the Non-Traditional and Emerging Transportation Technologies Council, which was within the Secretary's office to look specifically at these new and emerging technologies. And I know there's been a lot of discussion on both sides of the Atlantic with the Net Council and also with the appropriate counterparties within DG Move around how do we continue to foster this collaboration across these regions. And I think having that collaboration is going to be extremely important in moving the industry forward and moving technologies, clean technologies like Hyperloop forward. And we're really looking forward to being a part of that.
Thank you, Diana. William, just a few seconds, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, then I'll say something about global cooperation. I'm super glad that the Americans are back. And let's cooperate, but let's also compete with the Americans. I think it's great that a company like Tesla has challenged Volkswagen and has created all that change in the auto sector. I think we're looking for those types of new players to come and challenge the Airbuses and the MANs of this world in the aviation and shipping sector and in the trucking sector. So global cooperation, let's move in the same direction, but let's also have our companies and our engineers and the smart people compete, because that's the kind of, we need innovation and competition to get there. Thank you.
Indeed. I'll conclude by saying I couldn't agree more with Diana. I really do believe this has been a conversation, and I hope those of you watching will feel the same. Thanks again to all participants for an interactive debate, and in particular to Daniel, William, Annelies and Diana for their involvement. These are clearly evolving questions, which I'm sure will continue to be debated in future editions of this annual transport conference that Forum Europe hosts so kindly. It's been my great pleasure to help facilitate this session. The next and final panel session that will begin very shortly now will address road safety, which has come up in this debate many times. We'll also have a distinguished panel of speakers there representing the Estonian Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication, Intel, ASEA and Euro NCAP. Hope to keep in touch with you all. It's bye from me, and until next time. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.